Welcome. I'm Giovanni Zanalda, the Director of the Duke Center for International Global Studies and the Director of the Rethinking Diplomacy Program. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Today, webinars, it's on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, UN75, and the title of the webinar is Beyond Common Aspirations and Towards Common Solutions. First of all, I would like to welcome our main speaker, Dr. Cecilia Cannon. And unfortunately, Mr. Fabrizio Hochschild cannot join us today, but Dr. Cecilia Cannon will provide all the information and will cover all the documentation and documents that the UN 75 has prepared for this anniversary, and she will enlighten us, and she will take questions from the audience. So I will just say a couple of words of introduction, and then I will ask my colleague, Christian Lara Sedeno, to introduce Dr. Cannon, and also say something about this series that the Rethinking Diplomacy Program is organizing in a sort of celebration, the 75th anniversary of the UN, but it's really focused on the future of the UN. Before I ask Chris to introduce Cecilia, I will also say that Ambassador Bob Pearson will be the main he will ask questions after the presentation, and then I will collect all the questions through the Q&A function. So all the attendees who are willing to ask questions, please submit your questions during and after the presentation through the Q&A function. And all the questions that are not going to be answered because we have only 1 hour, will be sent to Dr. Cannon and her office, and they will answer in the future. And it's also a good opportunity to keep it open channel with the team who is in charge of this document, and they are looking for feedback, so feel free of sending this feedback today or in the future, and Dr. Cannon will say something more about that. Last thing is, I want to say thank you to the DUCIGS team for producing this webinar, to the Trend Foundation for supporting the Rethinking Diplomacy Program. And for closed captioning, there is a function. If you want to use the closed captioning function, please click on CC, which is on your screen. Dr. Chris, Lara, please, it's your turn.
Thank you, Giovanni, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are, and welcome to this first seminar of the Rethinking Diplomacy Program on the UN 75th anniversary. And among many global events last year, we had the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the global organization, but also the 100 years of the first global experiment of international cooperation to foster peace and security through the commitment of international actors to mutual trust and cooperation, the League of Nations. Created from the mistakes of the past 75 years ago, on its anniversary, more than a celebratory moment, the United Nations wanted to create a platform for listening from we the peoples and our aspirations, anxieties, and expectations. The UN75 Global Consultation was indeed an unprecedented initiative that reached millions of peoples in 195 countries. And I'm pleased to introduce today the first of a series of events hosted by DUCIGS, addressing the most relevant issues of current affairs highlighted by the UN75 outputs. In the forthcoming months, we will have 3 thematic webinars on the climate crisis, equitable health access, and the impact of digital technologies. All these 3 issues challenge the theory and practice of diplomacy. My name is Christian Lara, and I'm Rethinking Diplomacy Fellow. And at this point, I would like to extend a special thanks to the supporters and co-sponsors of this event. First, the Police Center for Politics and the International House at Duke University, as well as the DUCIGS super team behind this event, and in particular, Ambassador Robert Pearson, who will join me in facilitating this conversation. Without further ado, I would like to welcome our panelist today, which was part of the team behind this unprecedented initiative. And I will open the floor so she can share with us insights about the UN75 global consultation and what is next. And probably more important, how we can contribute as an academic community, because as we all know, we all have a role to play. Dr. Cecilia Cannon is joining us from Switzerland. She has been the academic advisor to the UN75 global consultation, working with the Office of the Undersecretary General Hochschild on activities related to the UN 75th anniversary, in particular, liaising with universities, think tanks, and academic institutions. Cecilia is the director of the Executive Masters in International Negotiations and Policymaking at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and she also directs the Graduate Institute's summer program on the United Nations and global challenges. No one better than Cecilia to know about the UN 75th anniversary and the UN 75 initiative and the role of universities and research institutions in operationalizing the findings. Please welcome Cecilia. Cecilia, thank you so much for being here. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chris. I think that was my cue to come on. Thank you very much for that introduction. Really, first of all, just would like to really send apologies from Fabrizio that he's unable to join the webinar today, and he shared his talking points and notes across with me, so I'll draw out some of the ideas that he was going to raise as well. But just to put this initiative in perspective, and I'll share some slides in a moment, because I really tried to put together some of the key analysis that we've done with the data collected across the year. This is my first year working with the United Nations, in collaboration with the United Nations. And it has really been, the opportunity of a lifetime after now many years of studying the United Nations, studying international negotiation and policy making, teaching, different programs related to the United Nations and global challenges, etc. So it's really been an amazing opportunity to work with the team at the United Nations on this UN75 initiative from my university, which seconded me over there with generous support of the Swiss government and the Fondation pour Genève. So to put this whole initiative in perspective, really what this 75th anniversary of the United Nations was, the Secretary General, he saw this really as an opportunity, not so much to hold grand celebrations. He noted, we all noted, even before COVID-19 hit and all the health effects, the socioeconomic effects that followed afterwards. We all saw that the global challenges that we were facing even before COVID were mounting, and were really, we were nowhere near on track to solving them. So the Secretary General and, as well as member states and other representatives in the United Nations, everyone agreed that it's not really a year for celebrations, the UN 75th anniversary. And instead, what the Secretary General did was launch this global conversation to really sort of take the temperature and take stock of where we're at with the global challenges that we're facing, where we're at with multilateralism and the global institutions that are in place to address them, because there was very much recognition that there's been a partial retreat from multilateralism in recent years, whether it's through financing, whether it's through growing tensions between superpowers, whether it's through gridlock on really important matters that we really need to press forward on before we really see imminent challenges. COVID-19 has now really exacerbated that. We've really seen regression in terms of human development levels. For the very first time, the UN Development Program that works on the Human Development Index, they saw the human development levels overall go down for the first time since they started recording human development levels in the 90s. The World Bank has also produced data across this year showing the real regression in terms of going backwards on so many indicators with respect to development, social, economic, etc. So it was really within this context that the initiative was launched. And also this idea of just engaging people, the idea of listening to people's priorities, but also hearing about the solutions that they propose for how we can really innovatively move forward on some of the global challenges that we're facing. So I'll share my screen just now. So this quote was just really what the Secretary General said in January of this year. But in this 75th anniversary year, I want to provide as many people as possible the chance to have a conversation with the United Nations, to share their hopes and fears, to learn from their experiences, to spark ideas for building the future we want and the United Nations we need. Together we need to listen, and together we need to act. So that's really the basis of the launching of the UN75 initiative. I'll go into the method and the data stream in terms of how this global conversation took shape. But overall, more than 1.5 million people engaged in the initiative from 193 countries, and they shared their short and long-term priorities, their ideas for action, and really their calls for a more inclusive, transparent UN to lead the response to pressing global challenges. One of the questions that I'm frequently asked about this initiative is, didn't the UN just speak to its usual community or the people it's already engaging with? And having worked really closely with the team, the UN75 team, on outreach to really make sure that it went beyond the usual people that the United Nations engages with. Within the team, there were people that were really focused on reaching out to youth, to universities and think tanks. That was my position, to really engage the research community. Citizens at the local level, whether it's through engaging local actors, local authorities, cities, civil society organizations, etc. Parliamentarians, cities and local government actors, we really reached out there. And then also the business and sports communities, as well as some youth gaming companies like Kahoot, who developed educational games around these topics to get feedback on where people's priorities lie. In terms of the data streams to really collect opinions from around the world, there were 5 data streams. The 2 main data streams, there was a 1-minute survey. Some of you may have taken it or seen the survey. But that survey, it really based and the entire initiative, it was really focused on collecting information around 4 main questions. So the first one was, what are your priorities for post-COVID recovery? Finding out, we're able to add that question very early on. What are your priorities for the world 25 years from now? So longer term priorities. What do you see as the biggest threats to the realization of that vision? So what are the biggest threats and obstacles and challenges in the way of achieving addressing the global challenges? And then what are your expectations of international cooperation and the UN in particular to solve these global challenges? Alongside that 1-minute survey, which was really the way to reach as many people as possible, it was very short. It took literally 1 minute, maybe 1.5 minutes when we added the 2 COVID questions. But basically, we also then opened up this possibility of UN75 dialogues. And with that, we had more than 3,500 dialogues registered in more than 120 countries. And we had set up a feedback form, a possibility where you could submit the summary of your dialogue and discussion to the UN75 team. And there we received more than 1,300 summaries from, so it was really a lot of people engaged. And when you look at where those dialogue summaries came from, you really see some diverse organizations really covering from all those 5 sectors that I just referred to. And they came in from 95 countries. So we also had a lot of global representation. In terms of, as a cross-check and a means to this initiative was open to everyone and anyone. And so one of the other questions that we would frequently be asked is it really representative in terms of those who are engaging? So in order to sort of cross-check the findings that were coming through the survey and the dialogues that were very much spearheaded by the United Nations, this UN75 team, we also conducted, Edelman Intelligence and the Pew Research Center conducted independent scientific pollings. Edelman Intelligence in 36 countries, mainly developing countries, lower human development countries, and Pew Research Center in 14 mainly developed countries, higher human development countries. So this was really, representative samples, and it was a way for us to cross-check then our findings. The numbers of those countries were lower than originally planned due to COVID-19 and restrictions of in-person surveys and their usual rigorous standards of methodology. Although the results that we have are robust enough to cross-check our analysis. We also then, Edelman Intelligence also conducted an independent media analysis in 70 countries. And this involved the manual and artificial intelligence analysis of print, broadcast, online, and social media in 70 countries. Alongside that, and this was again within my team's purview, but we also conducted a research mapping and really reached out a lot to universities, think tanks, policy research institutes. And we did a mapping in all 6 official UN languages of the latest research, particularly on multilateralism, international organizations, global governance, diplomacy, very much the sort of things the Rethinking Diplomacy is looking at. And we've really compiled a database of publications that are available on a data portal, which I'll talk about in a moment. To make that, the idea is to make it more accessible to policy makers, whether it's member states or within the UN Secretariat or any actors, what is the latest thinking? How can we make sure that the latest research is easily accessible when people are looking at some of these big questions? In terms of the breakdown of responses, in the end, our survey itself ended up being fairly representative when you look at geographic representation. So we really, through one of the big things that I learned, and really my eyes were opened in terms of one of the greatest assets within the United Nations is this network, this incredible network that it has through its country offices, through its regional offices, through its resident coordinators, through this enormous network of UN volunteers, and UN information centers. All this really large network really enabled a lot of local engagement with people in this initiative, and to see that mobilized in a very short amount of time was really inspiring for me, and something I hadn't previously fully understood, I realized. So what we had was, in terms of the data that we analysed for our final report, we cut the data in November. Now that 1.5 million figure I'm talking about is the full year. But we had 1.2 million responses, and you can really see a good representation from sub-Saharan Africa, Central and Southern Asia, and then good representation across some of the other regions there as well. In terms of gender representation, slightly higher male engagement than female, but more or less on par there. We also, in terms of education level, that was the one area where people who had higher education or beyond secondary, we did have a higher portion of people responding there, and rather than the lower levels of education. And then when you look at the age groups, one of the big objectives of the initiative was really to engage youth. And that really was a big, in terms of the outreach efforts, that was really achieved when you look at the numbers. So more than 50% were 30 or under in terms of the respondents. So really finding out what the youth are prioritizing was a big objective. So to go to the results, and I'm just going to quickly keep my eye on the clock because I can go on with these results. It's I found it very interesting to be engaged with. So here, what I've got, I've just pulled out some of the key findings, and I really, if you're interested to see what the opinions were in this latest report that we've published, we've put our results into perspective of some of the challenges the world people have been facing with respect to COVID-19. So we've really tried to draw in some other major reports that have been published throughout different UN agencies or international organizations to put in the results that we saw in terms of people's priorities with, for example, employment really coming down, employment levels really coming down, with inequalities widening. And the evidence that the UN Development Program has shown that is actually happening through the Human Development Index indicators, etc. So here I'll just draw out the main results though. So what we saw in terms of the immediate priorities, so that question about immediate priorities for recovering from the pandemic, we saw, as human development and as human development really was reversed and we saw inequalities really widen, many were really prioritizing in the short term access to basic services, including tackling inequalities and international solidarity. But among the basic services, when you look at the details, universal access to healthcare was the #1 priority globally across regions by far. And obviously the shortfall in healthcare to address the pandemic really saw that sit at the #1 priority across the year. And as we saw COVID-19 force children out of schools, investment in education and youth also ranked very high. And this was especially seen when you look at the regional variation in sub-Saharan Africa and in Central and Southern Asia. And then what we also saw is, when we looked into some of the COVID effects coming out of UNDP and seeing these figures of 3 billion people lacking basic hand washing facilities with soap and water during a pandemic, that access to safe water and sanitation was really a key priority across all human development levels. So it wasn't something that we only saw in the lower human development countries, but it was really evident there in the higher human development countries as well, the number of people who were really lacking access to basic, to safe water and sanitation. You can look into the details of the regional variation, but this is what this table is basically showing, the regions at the cross there and the priorities at the top there and the priorities down on the left-hand side. But really, we did see that universal access to healthcare as the #1. But after that, we did see some variation at the regional level. And it's really interesting to look at, where the priorities in the different regions are lying. In terms of global solidarity and support to the hardest hit places and addressing inequalities, that was particularly high in low and middle income countries and regions with low and middle income and lower human development countries. It was interesting to see that fewer respondents in very high human development countries viewed support to the hardest hit places as a high priority. This was a time when obviously COVID-19 has affected all countries, and sometimes it seems there was the tendency to look inward in response to COVID-19 and response policies, containment policies, etc. In terms of outlook for the future, globally, many more believe that we'll be better off in 2045 than today. So 49% of respondents, compared with 32% who believe we'll be worse off in the future. And here we really saw a correlation between higher human development countries and lower human development countries. So respondents in sub-Saharan Africa were most optimistic, with 59% saying we'll be better off in the future, followed by Central and Southern Asia and Eastern and Southeastern Asia. And conversely, in respondents in Northern America, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean and Oceania were most pessimistic. And in this latest report, we also got to work with the Human Development Index team in UNDP, as well as the team working on the Global Peace Index from the Institute for Economics and Peace in Australia. And we did some cross-analysis of our data, of what people's priorities are and their views and sentiments with those two indexes. And what we saw here is basically a cross-analysis of the Human Development Index with outlook for the future. And we really saw that the low Human Development Index countries, there was this correlation that we could see in terms of viewing the world as better off in 2045, vis-a-vis higher human development countries having a more pessimistic outlook for the future. We saw that same correlation in terms of those living in countries experiencing conflict or not. Those in conflict countries experiencing conflict really had more optimism for the future compared to those not experiencing conflict, which is a point for discussion of why. In terms of the threats, so what do people really see as a threat to addressing global challenges in the future, or for international cooperation to address? Across all regions, climate change and environmental issues was the #1 long-term global challenge that came forward. And the highest percentage of respondents who chose climate change and the environment as a top threat were really in Latin America and the Caribbean, with 73% of people really selecting that among the top priorities. And that was followed by Europe and Northern America with 71% within each of those regions, and Oceania and Antarctica. And when you think about, where people are really bearing the brunt of a lot of environmental disasters, whether it's increased hurricanes, whether it's bushfires, in Oceania and Antarctica and down in Australia, my home country, and rising sea levels, etc. It makes sense when these results. And what we then saw in terms of where people want more action in terms of global cooperation in the long term, more environmental protection was also the #1 priority there for respondents globally, and ranking in the top 3 priorities across regions. Other long-term priorities in terms of where people really wanted to see international cooperation and action really varied according to the income level and included employment opportunities, respect for human rights, and reducing conflict. So respondents, again here when we did our cross-analysis with the Human Development Index, respondents in higher human development countries prioritize the environment and human rights, and those in lower human development countries prioritize less conflict and meeting basic needs, including employment, healthcare, and education. More respect for human rights was #3 globally, and it was #1 in Northern Africa and Western Asia, and #2 in Northern America and Europe. We also saw a lot of change with respect to the priority, more employment opportunities across the year. And that really reflects, the income losses, the working hour losses, the job losses that people experienced across the year. So that rose from 10th priority when we issued a report in April to 6th priority when we've just now issued our final report. And we really saw then, some regional nuances in terms of priorities, but reducing conflict was really a high priority in Eastern and Southeastern Asia, Northern Africa and Western Asia, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. Interestingly, we also saw less conflict in terms of a long-term priority or aspiration appearing as well in countries not experiencing conflict, what the Institute for Economics and Peace calls very high peace countries. But when you look at the details of why, where they see the real threat, those in countries that are not experiencing conflict are more concerned about tensions between countries, while those in conflict situations are more concerned about violence within their borders. So it's, the different levels of detail there in terms of what their view of what conflict is when responding. In terms of the degree of importance of international cooperation, we saw overwhelming support for international cooperation. So 97% of respondents in our UN75 survey believe that international cooperation is important for addressing global challenges. 52% say it's essential, 34% that it's very important, 11% that it's fairly important. And only 3% of those 1.2 million responses that we analysed in the report believe international cooperation is not important or not important at all. But then when you look at the regional levels, that degree of importance that respondents put down, it's quite striking to see some of the differences there. So, essential with 74% in Northern America, for example, 70% in Latin America and Caribbean, vis-a-vis 49% saying essential in Central and Southern Asia, etc. So it's those different degrees of importance. We saw some differences across regions. What was very interesting to see as well is that COVID-19, the majority of respondents has said that it has really increased their views of the importance of international cooperation. There we saw some variance across regions in terms of the degree, but not as high as the previous question. Again, though, we did see a correlation between that human development level of the countries where the respondent was residing, and their view of international cooperation. And at this time, the higher the human development level of, we put the regional analysis there, the higher their perceived view of the need for international cooperation to address global challenges. cross-checking that, because this was what a question that we really did want to cross-check with representative samples to see, are we just patting ourselves on the back and saying, yes, everybody needs international cooperation, let's march ahead with that. So in Pew Research Centre's survey, remembering that was predominantly in higher income countries, 81% of respondents agree that countries around the world should act as part of a global community, working together to solve problems. And Edelman's survey, 74% agree that the UN is an essential organisation. This is specifically the UN. We had talked about international cooperation more broadly in our survey. When you look at the details, though, people were not uncritical of the United Nations, and they very much want to see new ways of working and new, for the global institutions broadly, but specifically for the United Nations. Many people came up with many suggestions and ideas. So in the Pew Research Centre's survey, so again, the scientifically sampled survey that they did, responses indicated that the UN must do more to ensure ordinary people are aware that the UN cares about their needs. So the UN was viewed in their survey, that graph on the right there comes from the Pew Research Centre survey. It was the promoting human rights, promoting peace, promoting economic development, access on infectious diseases. It was seen to play an important and high role there. But when you're looking at some of these other details, people really had that sentiment that the United Nations can be remote, that it's not so connected with individuals or caring about individuals, etc. Or that it deals effectively with international problems. So through the dialogues, and I'm almost finished, just to flag that with Chris and Giovanni, but what we were really able to get was a lot more detail that obviously couldn't be communicated through the survey, through the short 1-minute survey. So when looking at the United Nations, many respondents were really calling on the United Nations and looking to the United Nations to lead in international cooperation, both to address immediate response and recovery solutions with respect to the pandemic, health, socioeconomic effects of the pandemic, but then also on longer-term global challenges. But they really want the organisation to innovate, specifically to be more inclusive, engaged, accountable, and effective. And some of the suggestions that they put forward included more moral leadership from the United Nations, a reformed, more representative and more agile UN Security Council, a revised charter that includes today's most pressing global challenges like climate change, continued management and leadership reforms, more inclusive hiring practices, more accountability, more transparency, an inclusive and participatory UN system with improved understanding of the work of the UN among citizens around the world, and which shows more care for the needs of ordinary people, and improved implementation, including monitoring and evaluation of UN programs globally, so that problems can be solved more effectively. And there are many more ideas, which obviously I don't have time to go through. We'll leave time for questions. But just to flag in the report, what you'll find is some summary along key topics of what came out from the dialogue. So I've just summed up on upgrading the UN, but we have 11 different topics covered there in that report. So you can see a summary of really the key and most frequently referred to points there. And we worked with a team at the university where I'm at, the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies, to do qualitative analysis of those 1,000, at that time it was 1,140 summaries that we'd received. So really using social science methods, grounded theory methods to come up with the categories and the topics that we're really looking at there. So I won't go through the details, but likewise, you can also see the results from the media analysis on the data portal that they'll be uploaded. I think it should be by tomorrow, if not by tomorrow, by Monday, as soon as we finalize those. They're nearly there. But you can really see the media analysis of different topics and how they covered and the results that came through there. One final word just on what are we going to be doing? What's the United Nations going to be doing with all of this data gathered? So the first thing to mention is that we're making all of the data publicly available through this data portal. And I'm happy to share the link with you in the chat. But basically, you can find the raw survey data there already. The dialogues data we're uploading, it should be again by tomorrow or by Monday, but you can also there look to see, the coded analysis of the dialogues data. If people want to conduct further research, look into specific topics, you can sort by topic, etc. We've got the media analysis reports up there, as well as the independent polling that was done by Pew and Edelman. And then on the other hand, within the United Nations, in parallel to this UN75 initiative, what we had was the member states of the UN negotiated the UN75 declaration. And that contained 12 commitments. Well, overall, it was a recommitment to multilateralism, a recommitment to the UN playing a central role in addressing global challenges and international cooperation. But they also included 12 commitments that I've just got on the screen there. And they've asked the Secretary General to come back at the General Assembly next year in September with recommendations on how the United Nations, how international cooperation, different actors can move forward on these specific topics, half of which are focused on global challenges and issues, protecting the planet, leaving no one behind, etc. The other half more focused on the UN system and processes and upgrading the UN, etc., boosting partnerships. So I'll end there, and also just to say thank you very much for the opportunity to present the results as part of your program. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Cecilia. This was a very big effort to condense all this information in just a half an hour. And thank you very much for sharing these results with us. I want just to say, for those who did not have the opportunity to look at the document, the link to the document is in the chat. And we will also share more links when we will send a sort of thank you note with articles and videos and the links to the documents that Cecilia mentioned after this webinar. Bob, Ambassador Pearson, you have the honor of the first question, and then there are several questions from the Q&A that I'm sure we will find very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. I actually have two questions I'd like to pose. Dr. Cannon, thank you very much for a very detailed and very explicit explanation of all the work and the authenticity of the work and the value of the work going forward. I was thinking of ancient Greek drama and the Greek chorus, and this struck me as being a kind of global Greek chorus, warning us about things that could go wrong, telling us about things that we should do, and perhaps even giving the audience some hope that we would get there. So I think that this last year has been a setback, and you were very clear and honest about that. In light of those setbacks and in view of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are still in front of us to be achieved by 2030, how much more effort is required? Are we going to work just to catch up? Or do you feel like with this kind of feedback that there's actual genuine new progress to be made?
Thank you. And I'll respond immediately. Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question, and I think it's one that a lot of governments are probably grappling with right now, whether it's local level, country level, as well as at the regional and international level. We have these SDGs, the roadmap for the agenda for sustainable development, and all of those targets and indicators, etc. And we have seen massive regression this year, which is shocking. Like, to see the extent of it really is it's just shocking. And it's very easy to sort of become, disenfranchised and really seeing no bright future ahead, that we've got to regain all of that. But at the same time, we're also seeing a lot of optimism in terms of these crises often can create opportunities if we take it as an opportunity. If political will is really invested into not just going back to where we were before, but saying, how can we reset? Where do we need to reset? How can we redirect whether it's resources, whether it's political will, whether it's, what's really at the top of the policy agenda. And I think one of the things that is really coming through, and this came through in UNDP's recent Human Development Report, is that no one of these issues exists on its own. No issue related to development exists on its own. Today, whether it's climate change, whether it's the health pandemic that we're seeing, the interconnectedness of all of these issues has to be recognized. The SDGs do that. They really do bring together the different issues. So I really hope, and I'm seeing enough sort of, at least discourse about the need to reset and not just go back to where we were or regain, what's been lost, but to really reset and rethink how we can do it, which makes these sorts of programs very important.
Thank you. Just a specific follow-up, there are going to be so many demands on the world's resources to deal with COVID-19 and its aftermath, to deal with the resurgence of the global economy, we hope. And yet right in the middle of all of this agenda sits climate change and the climate crisis. How do you feel that the world can respond to this overwhelming priority as far as your respondents were concerned? At the same time, we're trying to deal with things that are very immediate and very consequential.
Yeah. Thanks. This is actually a topic that really came through very strongly in the dialogues, particularly among youth. There is the real concern that attention is going to be shifted away from the climate crisis that we're already seeing, and resources, etc., won't be channeled there. I've been quite encouraged when you look at the political discourse at the country level. In a lot of countries, there is recognition of this connection between the destruction of the natural environment and the pandemic and potential future health risks. And there is, a lot of discussion of moving to renewable resources, etc. It's really, the biggest question is how can we get that coordination and all actors involved and on board. And if you read in the report, people have come up with a lot of suggestions of ensuring this doesn't, fall off the agenda. And the Secretary General has really made sure that this year, 2021, is dedicated to climate action, basically. So but it's up to all of us to make sure that it doesn't fall off the agenda. And one thing to add just on the SDGs, the new UN75 declaration that member states adopted includes, the first one is leaving no one behind. And it's very much about using that SDGs 2030 agenda for sustainable development as the roadmap for ensuring no one is left behind and reducing inequalities, which we've seen exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I'll pass the microphone to Dr. Zanalda for follow-up questions from the Q&A. And thank you very much for your comments.
Thanks for your questions.
Thank you. Cecilia, there are a lot of questions. I want just to take care of some questions about the data, so then we can focus on other questions. One is whether the data set is going to be available. And yes, but you will send us the links, or if they are already available, we can send them to the attendees. The second is whether the data you presented are these just the responses from the survey? So the data that you presented, I suppose they were just from the survey.
Yeah. Yes, I should have specified, sorry. So all of the graphs that I presented at the beginning are indeed from the UN75 survey. At times I showed the cross-analysis with the Human Development Index, which is obviously the index developed by within UNDP. I did show a couple of graphs in there that I mentioned according to Pew Research Center survey and Edelman survey. So there. And the final slide with the points written, typed in, that was from the UN75 dialogues on ideas that people have put forward for upgrading the UN. And there are many, you'll find many more of those in the actual report. On those data sets, We're going to be making all of the data sets available, including the independent scientific studies. Our survey is already available. You can use filters to look by country, by region, by human development level, as far as I'm aware. So we'll send, it's called UN75 Data Portal. You can Google it and it should come up, but we can send the link so that you have that as well. And
Thank you, Cecilia. Another question is, how did you account for local differences in understanding of social, political, economic issues when assessing where priorities lie for different regions, countries?
Thanks. Yeah, so in our analysis there, it was very important for us to do the regional analysis of the survey data. So we were able then to really zoom in to look at where there were similarities. One of the things that came through strongly is that there's a lot of commonality in terms of people's short-term priorities, in access to basic services, basic needs, long-term priorities, climate and the environment. But as I mentioned, when you go down to people's second, third, fourth priorities, respondents' second, third, fourth priorities, that's where we did see some differences. So we really looked at the regional level. We did the analysis there, as well as looking at the different levels of human development, as well as looking at whether countries or respondents were living in conflict situations or not. So you'll find further details in terms of different ways we carved up the populations, from data speak, so to speak. But then in terms of where we really saw the nuances and the ideas coming through is from the UN75 dialogues, because they were all done at a very local level. They were done by youth groups, and they were all self-organized. Some were organized by local UN country officers or resident coordinator officers, but it was always with groups. The idea was to bring together different groups, whether it was from different sectors, etc. So in what we've got on the data portal, or what will go up in the next couple of days, is we've really summarized, according to those topics in the 12 commitments of the UN75 declaration, what did people really come through and say about protecting the planet, about leaving no one behind, about upgrading the UN, about boosting partnerships or engaging youth, putting women and girls at the center, etc. And there we really tried to keep as much as possible reference to the countries that we're saying, or at least the regions that we're saying different ideas. So you can really see sometimes it's really based on what people themselves are experiencing in their everyday lives, etc. So that's how we tried to do it. The biggest challenge was analyzing it real-time live data. Zero time to carry out the analysis and write up all the reports. So we had a wonderful team who really did a good job of doing that. But we hope we've captured some of those local differences in the reporting.
Thank you. Another question still about the survey is it's about education. Since English is a bit surprised by the fact that education seems odd. Education was not the most important challenge, but and climate change is and has been the sexy advertising. Was this taken into consideration? Because she believes that youth might have been influenced by media advertising, articles, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think in terms of education, so that what we had as the priority was more education and investment in youth programs, and it was very high. So we really saw it high. I recently, in the last few days, looked at the disaggregated data for the responses of people under 30. And we'll make that available in the coming days on the data portal. It's not in the main report. We couldn't put everything in there. But what's really interesting to see is still climate and the environment is number one. And perhaps, I can't say to what extent people have been, influenced by what's in the media, etc. But what I can say is what came through in the dialogue discussion from youth, holding dialogues, participating in dialogues, was very much a sense of unfairness, that they're inheriting a world that is riddled with natural disasters. That's, biodiversity loss was something that was discussed really at length, the rate of that. that they haven't had that they're going to inherit this mess, so to speak, young people, and really wanting to make sure that the minimal damage is put on now. So I would encourage you to look at, I think it's number 2, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of the commitment summaries will pop up on the data portal, but there's a lot of detail that came through, particularly from youth dialogues there, exactly on this, on where their reasoning for why they see this as a really major challenge that needs to be, people need to take priority. Yeah, that needs to take priority.
Thank you, Cecilia. Another question, I shift gear a little bit, and it goes back to the fact that we are talking about UN75. And this question comes from Mark Rees. Before the UN Charter in 1945, the UN began in 1942 as an anti-fascist military alliance based on the ideals of the 4 freedoms and the Atlantic Charter. In light of the UN75 results, do you think these ideals are still useful for the organization, or are they too abstract and removed from the hopes for material improvements in healthcare, response to COVID-19 and financial solidarity? That is, what is the relationship of the UN at 75 to its foundations in the 1940s?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question on what is the purpose of the United Nations, essentially, and what should that purpose, what was it at its foundation, what is it now, and what should its purpose be going forward? And I think that this is really the task now of the Secretary General and member states to decide what is that purpose. And when the SG comes up with the recommendations that to present in September at the General Assembly this year, 2021, he's really going to be considering all of the data that we've brought in from the UN75 initiative dialogues, which was why it was so important for us to get the reporting and details out there, and to him, but also, available to member states as well. And so maybe, I mean, that's a question, that broadly speaking, we need to really discuss. What is and should be the purpose of the United Nations? First and foremost, it's about intergovernmental cooperation. It's about now the cooperation of many more actors beyond governments. And one of the things that really came through in the dialogue discussions is the need for the UN to be more inclusive. And so, to what extent should it now open up, not beyond, but to include more actors in the discussion of addressing global challenges, etc. But keeping the peace. One of the things that I like to talk about with the United Nations and my students on the summer program in the UN is very much this idea of it's not about just all living in peace and everybody's all getting along. It's actually about being able to engage in tough political issues and dialogue and discussion on those, and being willing to around a table, as opposed to these days on Twitter or on in battlefields, etc. But it's that idea of saying, yes, we might have differences, yes, we have many differences of opinion amongst us, and then at the same time, what's heartening through our data is that we really have a lot more in common than the media headlines might suggest, etc. So, I mean, that purpose of dialogue, of working through challenges peacefully, I think remains integral. And then if we really want to address these global challenges that we need that international cooperation. We need to cooperate across borders, because the challenges are bigger than what any one individual country can address on its own. And beyond member states, you have to bring in the business community, you have to bring in civil society or other actors, local actors, cities that are really connected on the ground if you want to bring about concrete change, etc. So it's not a very coherent response, but bringing together different ideas that have come through our data and other thinking. I'd be interested to hear what others think as well, including Ambassador Pearson and
Sure. Another question is, does the UN anticipate any major changes in its work given the new Biden administration versus the Trump administration, especially given the Biden administration's renewed focus on topics like climate change and equality? Yeah, I mean, we've seen, we've seen in recent days, rejoining the Paris Agreement, recommitment to the World Health Organization,
there is that recommitment to international cooperation and international organizations addressing major issues right now there. So, I mean, in short, that recommitment is visible in the actions that have been taken across the last few days.
This is a very different question. I understand that it's not necessarily for you in the sense you are not the Director General of the UN, so it is hard to see the UN as other than an organization set up to fail at the beginning, as members of the Security Council themselves are significant violators of human rights and willing to defend their allies from accusations of human rights violation. Is this what is meant by reform of the institution? And of course, I would add to this, because human rights feature very high in your survey, so it's an interesting question.
Yeah, no, that's right. I'm just jotting that down. Yes, I mean, the human rights did really come through high, and in terms of Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, this year has been quite vocal and speaking on, particularly with related to COVID-19 containment policies and all of that sort of thing, but speaking about a regression of human rights, etc., and the importance of upholding agreements that governments have signed onto, essentially, so the standards, etc. When I have students who, in the summer program on the UN in particular, who were basically saying, it's too political, this organization, it is a political organization, so you're always going to have these issues. And it comes back to what I was just referring to a moment ago, the United Nations and that famous quote that Hammarskjöld made famous. He didn't come up with it himself, but he made it famous. The UN wasn't created to take mankind to heaven, but to save it from hell. Not those exact words, but something along those lines. But it's this idea, it's never going to be a perfect organization, because they're dealing with member states who are all political bodies in themselves, changing political cycles constantly. But it's about being able to sit around the table and discuss and come up with solutions and address things and tough issues. And if anything, I would say that's one thing that that I would like to see more of, is not shying away from those tough discussions and tough issues, but seeing that engagement in those issues not as a breakdown of multilateralism or a retreat from multilateralism, but that's the purpose of multilateralism, to engage on those tough topics.
Another question is about we go back to the survey. So how effective is the UN75 survey able to reach people from rural areas or areas that are less likely to engage with social media polls? Is there a big issue when where the data being collected is not representative of the people around the world? You touch upon this, but I think it's a very important issue.
Yeah. It became even more important with COVID-19 and lockdown measures, etc. So we really worked closely with, there's an organization within the UN linked to UNDP called the SDG Action Campaign that have a lot of local networks, etc. But what we did was we developed a paper survey, and we had a lot of, like, hundreds within countries of UN volunteers physically go out. You can see photos from our September report of a number of them, in different countries, but they went out and they really, keeping social distancing, within health guidelines, etc., went out and got responses on physical paper, and they were manually input into the database, etc. There was also an offline app that was developed so that people could download it, again, often UN volunteers, but others could download the app, take it out to areas that don't have internet service, have responses, and then when there's internet services, it gets uploaded, etc. So we really did take efforts to reach out to rural areas as well as those not connected through the internet.
Thank you. This is a question that has to do with if you are familiar with the African American, the reparations issue that is certainly has been discussed in the US and still, of course, discussed in the US. So reparations for African Americans was a major part of election dialogue in the US recently. I feel that to hold only American European parties monetarily responsible for the transatlantic enterprise to be somewhat incomplete. What are the possibilities of the UN and the African Union negotiating the establishment of continental African nation state via AU, African Union land concessions as reparations for the historical kidnapping and displacement of American descendants of slavery? I don't know if this emerged during the survey or when you collect data, or
definitely not to the detail that the question is going into, and I'll be very honest, it's not an area of my expertise in terms of providing a response. But what we did see coming through strongly in discussions was this question of discrimination and racial discrimination in particular, as well as gender discrimination. And yeah, so I mean, I don't really have enough to comment specifically on the you know, the details of that question, but it was, yeah, overcoming racial discrimination, etc., was a very high priority among reducing inequalities. I don't know if Ambassador Pearson would like to comment, or yourself, if you'd like to respond.
No, because I feel that it has to do with the UN, African Union, and you know, I cannot speak for them, but it's an important question to keep in mind, and we will include in the all the questions. I want to take it. Sorry, we are going above a little bit time, if you don't mind that, but there are some very interesting questions. One has to do, is very different, has to do with American universities. Samantha Power, former UN ambassador from the US, in the current Foreign Affairs, writes about the importance of American universities in developing US foreign policy during American era of internal reform. How can our great American universities contribute to the global effort to address climate change?
This is a great question in terms of it's something that I've been working on concretely across the year, and we, in the preparations for this, we talked a little bit about you know, the increasing need for science diplomacy and you know, this interface between research, evidence and policy making. How can universities contribute? So across this year, we really engaged more than 400 universities who held their own dialogues, who, you know, collected survey responses from their communities, etc. So we've included a lot of what came through there. But in terms of making research more easily accessible and evidence data more easily accessible to policy practitioners, I mean, I think it really comes down to more dialogue, but oftentimes better communication of research results. And this is something I work on a bit at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. We need clearer data visualization to communicate, you know, the major findings and present it in a way that can be picked up quickly and efficiently, because policy practitioners are time-starved. They're, you know, one of the courses I teach for our master's students is how to prepare a policy brief based on, you know, evidence-based, you know, research and data, etc. And it's really about understanding who your target audience is in policy processes. If you're working on climate change, if you've got data and results that can feed into policy processes, whether it's to support certain policy solutions, etc., there are very, you know, simple steps that you can take and to present this in a way that can be easily accessible. But digital technology as well at the moment. There's a project, you know, that I was involved in, you know, helping convert to make it accessible, looking at sanctions, called Sanctions App, looking at the effectiveness of different United Nations sanctions regimes. And you can plug in, you know, all the different conditions of the different situations in a country and look to see what sorts of sanctions and which resolutions through the UN Security Council have been developed and that sort of thing. But really coming up with innovative ways to present your results and analysis so that it's more easily accessible by policy practitioners is probably what I would say.
Thank you. I will say one last question, and thank you to the Singh, who has been very patient, because this was one of the first questions, but I think it's a good question to ask now. And it's also important to see whether this emerged in during the survey, even if it was not a question that you asked, whether you got through the dialogue some feedback on this. How is the UN responding to criticism of the Security Council, namely that is not representative of global nations? Are there plans to expand the representation on the Security Council by adding perhaps more countries such as India, and or including countries from regions that are not well represented?
Thank you. Yeah, a really important question also came through very, frequently in the dialogue discussions. Security Council reform has been on the agenda of member states. It's up to member states to decide to reform the Security Council. Since the 1990s, there have been different resolutions put forward for different reforms, and there are some lovely timelines that you can find, online, showing the different resolutions across time, showing the different proposals for reform. So there are different types of reform of the Security Council as well. Some are administrative and process driven. And there, what's interesting to see is we actually have seen enormous reform in terms of more transparency of the Security Council's proceedings. This has come not only from people out, non-members, non-governmental organizations, etc., but non-permanent members or non-Security Council members. Member states themselves have also really pushed for more transparency of the Security Council, and that with a lot of gains. So it's important to see there has been some reform. In terms of representation, this is the most difficult issue to grapple. I think there is broad consensus that representation needs to expand. It needs to be more regionally representative. There definitely needs to be representation from the African continent on there among other countries. What is the most challenging thing is to reach consensus on what that change and expansion of the Security Council or change in representation should look like. And that's where you can find, again, online, the different country grouping positions on what those models look like. But I think one of the great things to look at on that is Kofi Annan's Enlarger Freedom document from early 2000s. I've forgotten the actual date of it, but you'll find it, Enlarger Freedom, maybe 2005. Anyway, look it up, maybe a little bit earlier. But you'll see in there two models of enlarging the Security Council with two different, changes in representation. And that's one that I've seen people go back to over and over again. It's in the UN75 declaration under the paragraph on upgrading the United Nations, that reform of the Security Council is needed. The question is how to go about it and how to get consensus on what that will look like.
Thank you, Cecilia. You have done a marvelous job of tackling all the questions. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, and also you mentioned this, please feel free of sending more questions directly to us, and then we can send the questions or feedback, even though the dialogues are going to close on the 31st of January, we can keep it open in the sense that we can still provide feedback, and because this is just the end of one phase, but it's also the beginning of another phase. So more feedback and more people are involved in rethinking really about the role of the UN and the future of the UN that will benefit all countries or regions or people is very important. So thank you very much for that. Before closing, I know, and I apologize, I know Chris' voice went up and down, so I would like to give Chris the opportunity to say some final words and just remind all the participants who are still in line, which is a large number, that we will send a thank you note with information about this and future events, and stay tuned. And again, thank you very much to Cecilia for being so available today. Chris?
Yes, thank you, Giovanni, and thank you, everyone. Sorry for the hiccups, the technical hiccups at the beginning, but Cecilia, thank you for being with us today. And I will say as a final word that as a takeaway, I think the 75th anniversary was an opportunity for the UN to open a serious discussion on this, a serious moment in history. And I think in that sense, the objectives of the UN75, that was to gather the inputs with the peoples about their hopes, fears, and expectations, it was achieved. and also identifying the priorities for action moving forward. And I understand the UN75 as an initiative that is a prelude to for a roadmap that describing the lines of actions for building back better after this tumultuous year to 2020 and what is ahead of time. The ultimate question is what we can do. And I think as we continue rethinking diplomacy and in this space, we continue to think about climate change, universal health access, and technical digital cooperation. So thank you so much for all the attendees, and let's stay tuned as we continue this series of seminars. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.